Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We try to check out great theories and discoveries, concepts that you don't know anything about because they've been suppressed. Things that the powers that be have determined that you shouldn't know. They have persecuted the author or just ignored them, and they've left some things that would be very useful for you to learn if you only knew of them. Now, some of these theories and discoveries are a little bit difficult to get into as well, slightly inaccessible, and I try to, be a guide for you. Having gone through the difficult process already, I try to, make the path a little bit easier for you. And today is our, I believe it's our 298th Bible Decode. We've been looking at the Bible from different perspectives, a lot of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was actually written by the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty. We've also looked a lot at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and will continue to do so. And we are looking at some of the contextual aspects of the Bible here with this book by Bronson Keeler called History of the Bible. And so now we're looking at some of the history, not the Bible itself, but like who wrote the Bible, when did they write it, why did they write it, what was at stake, what were these people like, what language is it written in? Where was it written? And, why is it these particular 66 books, if you have the Protestant Bible? Why is it these particular 66 books that have made the cut, but then the hundreds of other books that have not made the cut? And, a lot of Christians don't even know that, there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but there are literally dozens of other Gospels that didn't make the cut. And I wonder why, most Christians don't, or many Christians don't know that, but the ones who do are, even if they do, they are not curious about what those other books say. You would think that somebody who worships Jesus would like to know as much as possible about him, even if it's not completely truthful, just to have those different perspectives. You might be able to just get a few details or a few nuggets from some of these other books. There's also dozens of books of Acts and other epistles, and there are even several other versions of the book of Revelation, or several other revelations. So these are the kind of things that he deals with in this work. Now, this work is from 1881, and so he forwards. I like to think of the five major Western religions: Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and then also Satanism and atheism, which is otherwise known as scientism, scientific materialism. And I believe that this author suffers a little bit from too big of a dose of his scientific materialism, which I think was probably on the rise here at the late 19th century with the Industrial Revolution, and thinking that science is going to save us. So it went from people, thinking that Jesus is going to save us, or Yahweh is going to save us, Allah is going to save us, and now we're at science is going to save us. But he does make some interesting points, and they all have to be taken with a grain of salt, and you may need to read other histories of the Bible just to get a more well-rounded perspective. So this is just a start for that. I'm going to close out with his last sentence of chapter 6 and then move into chapter 7. I'm starting this because he ended another chapter with the exact same phrase here. The Bible did not form the beliefs formed the Bible. Okay, now we're getting to chapter 7. And keep in mind, he says that all of his important stuff is in chapter 8. So we got to get through this chapter to get to the, get to the main course, I guess. But chapter 7 is called the heretics. But one answer has ever been made to these facts, and that is that they were the result of heresy. The Orthodox theologians of this age, now he talks a lot about the Church Fathers, and that's what he's talking about here. All these different Church Fathers from the 2nd to the 5th century AD, such as Saint Ignatius and Irenaeus and Clement of Rome, and also Clement of Alexandria, Hegesippus, and Tertullian, Origen, Eusebius. These are all these different people who lived at that time that were trying to kind of forward the Christian belief system. Now, many of the Roman origins hypothesis people would claim that these were actually pen names of Romans, and this is all part of the psychological operation that the Romans were participating in to write the New Testament in order to really mellow out the Jews and really to get people on board with kind of like a universal religion, as Christianity is kind of a mishmash of all kinds of different other pagan religions, such as, the mystery religions and Mithraism and Serapism, and which is a mishmash in itself, Egyptian mythology and religion, Greek mythology and religion, and so on. And so, the Romans were really trying to compile all those things together to make one universal religion. That's what the word Catholic itself means, is universal. And in order to do that, they wrote the New Testament and used this fictional character Jesus in order to dictate to the Jews that the Jews who were waiting on a military Messiah. They were waiting on a Messiah who was going to help them overthrow the Romans. And so the Romans countered by proposing a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah who was cooperating with Rome. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and turn the other cheek to oppression, and accept the authority of your slave master. And so a Jewish Messiah who was cooperating with the Romans and at the same time was castigating the Jews for their over-reliance on rituals, overturning the tables of the money changers in the outer perimeter of the temple, and cussing out the merchants who were selling the small animals for the sacrifice at the temple. These are ways that Jesus is chipping away at the Jewish traditions and rituals, which the Romans found so hard to deal with in terms of administering their empire. And they saw that the Jews were just a clear threat, as they had developed this nation state inside the Roman Empire, and that there were Jews sprinkled all over the empire. And they really saw the Jews as a major threat to their ability to administrate the whole empire, because these kind of things could spread. That's the way that the Romans were thinking. Okay, so now, but back to this, we're talking about the early church fathers. So where he says the orthodox theologians of this age, the church fathers, assume to be the inheritors of pure and unadulterated Christianity, as taught by the orthodox fathers of the early ages. And they say that while the New Testament, as we now have it, was recognized by the fathers, the extra-canonical books were used and the intercanonical books were discarded solely by the heretics. Very intelligent men make this claim, and the wonder is that it should have to be discussed. I need hardly say to the reader that the theory is quite groundless. We have seen in a preceding chapter that the Orthodox Fathers declared many books to be divine and inspired, which are now without the canon, and are declared by Orthodox theologians of today to be uninspired. And we shall see in the next chapter that, on the other hand, many Orthodox Fathers rejected books which are today in the canon and considered the Word of God. Irenaeus denied the Pauline authorship of the Epistle of the Hebrews, yet no one calls him a heretic. In fact, he wrote a book against heresies himself. Hippolytus, not sure, also denied its Pauline authorship, and he too wrote a book against all heresies. Heresy was an easy charge in those days. Tertullian, one of the founders of the New Testament, became a Montanist. That is, that contradictions should never be allowed to tarnish a text written under the immediate supervision of the Holy Spirit. Dr. Adam Clark, a venerable Methodist commentator, proposed the same thing. And we have a very marked instance of the the change of text by Orthodox scholars in the recent revision. They made the revision to correct the text. So did the heretics, and they said they were correcting and not corrupting it. They acted in good faith, and orthodoxy now impugns their motives while doing the same thing. It is a strange mental trait which permits an action to be entirely right in our sect and entirely wrong in another's. No opprobrium should be attached to those early Christians simply on the charge of heresy. Heretic does not mean a bad or a depraved man, nor a man who believes what is not true. It means a man who uses his own judgment in selecting his belief, rather than submits his judgment to another. The Church, to maintain its power, has undertaken the control of belief, and has prescribed what it should be, and the heretic has been the man whose opinion differed from the Church's. In very many instances, the heretic has been right and the Church has been wrong. In many cases, it has been the reverse, and in many more, both have been wrong. But the principle at stake has been, and ever must be, that a man has the right to do his own thinking. To be called by epithets has ever been the penalty which intelligence pays to ignorance, and to suffer the tribute which genius pays to mediocrity. The man who uses the word heretic but betrays his intellectual debasement, and, as between two men, one orthodox and the other heterodox or heretical, the latter is always the more intelligent and almost invariably the more noble and the more moral. So it was with the early heretics. Carpocrates, one of them, taught that men were to be saved by faith and love. Cerinthus, another, believed that after the resurrection, Jesus was to establish an earthly kingdom, a doctrine which has since become one of the commonest Orthodox beliefs. Yet for this, it is said, John, quote, the beloved disciple, would not remain in the same house with him. The most famous of the so-called heretics was Marcion, who flourished about the middle of the 2nd century. His offense consisted solely of being a follower of Paul as opposed to Peter. He seems to have been a high-minded and excellent man, notwithstanding the efforts of his enemies to defame his character. What he desired was to reproduce, in its original simplicity, the gospel of St. Paul. And for this, Polycarp, another church father, whose orthodoxy is unquestioned, called him the firstborn of Satan. He said that he wished to introduce no innovation, but only to restore what had been corrupted. He had rationalistic tendencies, and he wanted a stricter discipline and a sterner logic in the church. He aimed to establish a new line of bishops, with St. Paul at its head, and as the Petrine line was already established, this was what modern politics calls an unholy alliance, striking at the bread and butter of the men already in, and hence the efforts to blacken his character. Okay, we are done with chapter 7. It's a short one. And we are on to the major chapter in this book, chapter 8, called The Christian Canon. We now come to the formation of the Christian canon. If you don't know canon just means like the accepted books. So the Christian canon includes the 27 books of the New Testament, starting with Matthew and ending in Revelation, and how these books were formed as a whole. That has come down to us. Now, nowadays, there would never be, at least in my opinion, there would never be like a situation where all of a sudden we decided to get rid of a couple of the books and add a couple other books. That would cause riots or whatever. You know, people would be up in arms. That would never be acceptable. But there was a long period of time where there was some fluidity about what is included in the canon, what isn't. And now you also may know that the Protestant canon is slightly different from the Catholic canon. And the Eastern Orthodox canon is also slightly different than the Protestant canon. So there is a slight difference, but you know, I don't know exactly the dates that are involved, but the Christian canon or the Protestant canon has been the Protestant canon for quite some time. I mean, there haven't been any new additions or subtractions to the canon in quite some time. So, but now we're going to learn from Keeler how the whole thing was formed. We now come to the formation of the Christian canon, to the process by which it was evolved. In a preceding chapter, I gave a brief outline of the formation of the Old Testament canon among the Hebrews, and left the Old Testament canon among the Christians to be detailed with the New Testament, preferring to give them together and thus preserve the unity. Beginning with the first 2 centuries of the Christian church, we find that there was no New Testament as we now understand that term. More than 40 Gospels and a much greater number of Acts, epistles, and revelations were in use. The writer of the Gospel according to Luke says, quote, "For as much as many have taken in hand to set forth in order a declaration of these things," showing that when he wrote, many Gospels were already in existence. From the mass of writings then in circulation, the books in our New Testament were taken, and the other books dropped out of use. Origen says, now Origen was writing in the early 3rd century mainly. Origen says, and that not 4 Gospels, but very many were written, out of which these 4 we have chosen and delivered to the churches, we may perceive. End quote. The selection of the books and the formation of the list were a very slow process, and it is impossible to point to any period as marking the date at which our present canon was determined. Okay, so that's answering my question. It's impossible to point to any period marking that date. I don't know why that would be. But the result of formation of the canon was obtained gradually, spontaneously, silently. There is no evidence to show that at any time the claims of the apostolic writings to be placed on an equal footing with the Old Testament, which formed the first Christian Bible, were deliberately discussed and admitted. Step by step, the books which were stamped with apostolic authority were separated from the mass of other works which contained the traditions of less authoritative teachers. When the Catholic Church began to be formed about the years 170 to 180 AD, the tendency was to use fewer books, and the ones accepted as authoritative began to be called divine. It would seem that, of the 4 Gospels, 3 of them, the so-called synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all basically the same. So it would seem that just for eliminating confusion, they would just pick one of those 3, probably Luke, one of those 3, and drop the other 2, because they all, Matthew is like 90% the same as Mark. Now, the chronology is supposed to be that Mark was written first and then Matthew, and Matthew's just more or less a copy of Mark. There's a few other things that are added in. He corrects a few of Mark's geographical errors, but then Luke puts them back in. But Luke is just a longer work and is only maybe 50 or 60% the same as Mark. But they're all telling the same story right down the line. So if the tendency was to use fewer books, you would think that one or 2 of those synoptic Gospels would have been lopped off. But that's just an aside. So the reader will observe that I have said in one place that the early fathers originated the theory that these books were divinely inspired, and in another place that the heretics did so. There is no contradiction here. Both the fathers and the heretics were Christians. They simply belonged to different sects. In the contest for the mastery, it so happened that the sects to which the fathers belonged, the Petrine, or the followers of Peter, gained the supremacy, and from them arose the present Christian church. Now, you also may know that the book of Mark is said to have been informed by Peter. When it says the gospel according to Mark, according to basically means that it was not written by Mark. It was written down by Mark, and that he was informed about what happened by Peter. Whereas the book of Luke is supposed to have been, the gospel according to Luke was supposed to have been informed by Paul. Paul was a kind of an informant, even though Paul was not present at the events. Anyway, so the fact that the Petrine gained the supremacy, maybe it deserved it because it was written first. Now, this is all if you even think that any of this is not fiction, which I believe that all of it is fiction, but just, for the sake of argument. The Petrine gained the supremacy, and from them arose the present Christian church. Had other sects, and so Peter, was the first, supposed to be the first pope, and so the whole Roman, Catholic ideas are stemming from Peter. More of the Protestant ideas are from Paul, and John, according to this book, kind of his legacy was more the Eastern Christian church, Byzantine. Okay, so Peter gained the supremacy, and from them arose the present Christian church. Had the other sects gained the victory, their fathers would now be the Orthodox authorities, and the others would be the heretics. Now it is true that in the so-called heretical sects originated the theory that the New Testament was divine and of equal authority with the Old. But that doctrine would not have been accepted by us had not the Orthodox fathers of that time adopted it into their sects. We are the descendants of the Orthodox sects, and so far as we are concerned, the early fathers originated the theory. They did it to have authority for the new and unusual doctrines coming into use, just as the heretics were using the same theory to support their doctrines. The books were, in those days, mainly in the hands of the bishops. The laity had nothing to do with them. Not 1 in 10,000 of the laity could read. Really? I would have said 1 in 100, 1 in 10,000. The recognition of the authority of the New Testament was brought about entirely by ecclesiastical usage. Each father included in the newly forming Bible what books he liked and excluded what he did not like. The consequence was there were as many Bibles in those days as there were fathers engaged in making them. And there's, I think, a lot to be said for that. Although I would not stop with fathers, I would just take it to every person. Give every Christian should be able to access every one of these books, and then they can decide which ones they want. And the marketplace will decide, which ones are more convincing. Now, there's certainly some bias involved, but as it is, your priest or your reverend pretty much tells you that you're not allowed to read these apocryphal books because they're either satanic or they're evil or they're just, false. And some of them might be false, but there's just plenty of stuff already in the canonical books that are clearly false. So, what is the standard that we're using here? Again, I think it comes back to what he said at the end of the last chapter. The beliefs form the Bible. The Bible did not form the beliefs. So the fathers made no attempt to compare the books by a critical investigation into the history of the records themselves. Dr. Westcott says the canon was, quote, formed by instinct and not by argument. Instinct is not a good thing to form a Bible by. The fathers contended for centuries as to what should go into the list until they found they could not agree, and then the church held councils and voted on it, and the books which polled the most votes went in. St. Augustine was a great advocate of this plan. He thought that the books and Augustine was early 5th century. He thought that the books which were received by all the churches should be in the Bible, and that in the case of books on which there was a difference of opinion, the majority voice of the churches should decide it. An exact parallel to this is found in the manner of making changes in the recent New Testament revision. On the first reading of a disputed text, a majority vote authorized the amendment, but on the second and final reading, a 2/3 vote of all those present was necessary. But even this plan did not work satisfactorily in the church, for the councils differed. One council would adopt a list inserting books which another had rejected, and rejecting books which another had inserted. And this continued until the church held one great council, adopted a final list, and said, "This is the Bible, believe it or be damned." Let us now go over the history of the past 2,000 years and see what have been the fluctuations and the variations in the canon. The first collection of New Testament books ever made was by Marcion, the heretic, about the year 145 AD. It consisted of one gospel and 10 of Paul's epistles. Now, I believe that gospel is Marcion's gospel. It consisted of one gospel and 10 of Paul's epistles, and they were not then considered the Word of God. Quote, and this quote is from Davidson. Faith in the divine authority or inspiration of current books had not yet arisen. Marcion did not consider Paul's epistles inspired or of divine authority. This was more than 75 years after Paul was dead. The epistles which Marcion accepted were Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, Philippians, and Philemon.